In the heart of Millbrook, where the whispers of history intertwined with the hum of modern life, 17-year-old Marcus Johnson often found himself caught between two worlds. The town, with its cobblestone streets and century-old oak trees, held a charm that masked an unspoken tension. To outsiders, Millbrook was a postcard-perfect slice of Americana. But for Marcus, it was a place where the shadows of the past still lingered, casting long silhouettes over his future. Marcus was no ordinary teenager. His mind worked in ways that defied convention, unraveling the complexities of quantum mechanics with the same ease others solved crossword puzzles. Yet, his brilliance was often overshadowed by the assumptions people made about him. In a town like Millbrook, where tradition sometimes clung too tightly, his presence was both a curiosity and a challenge. He wasn't just a young black man navigating the pressures of adolescence, he was a symbol of potential that many refused to see. The town's river, winding and unyielding, mirrored the undercurrents of its social dynamics. It was beautiful, yet dangerous, its depths hiding jagged rocks and unseen currents. Officer James Hartley, with his rigid demeanor and unyielding sense of authority, was a product of these same depths. To him, Millbrook was a place to be preserved, its traditions protected at all costs. He saw himself as the gatekeeper, but his vision was clouded by biases he refused to confront. The badge he wore was a mirror, reflecting not just his duty but also his fears. One evening, as the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, Marcus found himself walking home from the library. The weight of his backpack was nothing compared to the thoughts swirling in his mind, ideas for a new algorithm, fragments of equations that danced just out of reach. The street lights flickered above him, their glow soft yet unsteady, much like the town itself. It was then, at the corner of Elm and Main, that his path intersected with Officer Hartley's. A single moment, charged with unspoken tension, would set off a cascade of events neither could have foreseen. The encounter was brief but electric, a spark igniting a fire that would consume the town's carefully constructed facade. What began as a misunderstanding escalated into something far greater, exposing the fractures beneath Millbrook's polished surface. For Marcus, it was a moment of reckoning, a test not just of his intellect but of his resilience. For Hartley, it was a confrontation with truths he had long ignored. And for the town, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that the past could not be buried beneath manicured lawns and white picket fences. As the days unfolded, the ripples of that evening spread outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. Marcus's brilliance, once dismissed or overlooked, became impossible to ignore. His ideas, born from a mind that refused to be confined, began to attract attention far beyond Millbrook's borders. But with recognition came resistance, as those who clung to the old ways struggled to reconcile his achievements with their preconceptions. It was a battle fought not with fists or words, but with the quiet determination of a young man who refused to be defined by others. This is the story of Marcus Johnson, not just a tale of genius, but of courage. It is a reminder that progress often comes at a cost, and that the brightest lights are forged in the darkest moments. In the heart of Millbrook, where the past and present collided, one young man proved that the future could be rewritten, one equation at a time. In the quiet corners of Millbrook, where the whispers of history intertwined with the hum of modern life, Marcus Johnson often found himself caught between two worlds. His days were a delicate balancing act, excelling in his AP classes while navigating the unspoken rules of a town that wasn't always welcoming to someone like him. His teachers marveled at his intellect, though few could comprehend the depth of his brilliance. But for Marcus, the equations and algorithms he scrawled into his notebooks were more than academic pursuits. They were an escape, a place where logic reigned and the chaos of the world could be momentarily silenced. Yet, Millbrook wasn't a town that let anyone escape its gaze for long. The community thrived on its traditions, its unchanging routines, and its unspoken hierarchies. Marcus's mother, a nurse who worked grueling hours, often reminded him to keep his head down and focus on his future. She had seen too many promising young lives derailed by the weight of expectations, or the sharp edges of prejudice. Marcus listened, but his mind was always elsewhere, solving problems far greater than the ones Millbrook seemed intent on creating. Officer James Hartley, on the other hand, was a man who thrived on control. His patrols through Millbrook streets were more than a job, they were a ritual, a way to assert his presence in a town that he believed needed order. To Hartley, Marcus wasn't just another teenager, he was a question mark, a variable in an equation that Hartley didn't trust. And while Marcus saw the world in terms of possibilities, Hartley saw it in terms of threats. Their collision was inevitable, a meeting of two forces that couldn't coexist without friction. But Marcus wasn't alone in his journey. His best friend, Elena Rivera, was his anchor, a fiery artist who painted the world as she wished it to be, not as it was. Her canvases, filled with bold colors and unapologetic truths, were a stark contrast to Marcus's precise calculations. Yet, the two shared an unshakable bond, each finding in the other a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to be underestimated. Together, they dreamed of a future far beyond Millbrook's borders, a world where their talents could flourish without restraint. As the seasons changed and the days grew shorter, the tension in Millbrook became palpable. The incident between Marcus and Officer Hartley was no longer just a moment, it was a spark that ignited conversations the town had long avoided. Neighbors who once exchanged polite smiles now found themselves on opposite sides of a growing divide. And amidst the turmoil, Marcus discovered something unexpected: allies. Teachers who saw his potential, community leaders who recognized the injustice, and even strangers who were inspired by his resilience began to rally around him. Through it all, Marcus remained focused, channeling his energy into a project that would redefine not only his future but the way the world saw him. Late nights spent in his small bedroom, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens, became the foundation of something extraordinary. What began as a personal challenge evolved into a groundbreaking innovation, a testament to the power of determination and intellect in the face of adversity. By the time the dust settled, Millbrook was no longer the same. The town's carefully maintained facade had cracked, revealing both its flaws and its potential for change. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, a young man who had transformed not only his own life but the lives of everyone around him. His journey was far from over, but one thing was clear: the boy who once walked Millbrook streets with the weight of the world on his shoulders was now a force to be reckoned with, a beacon of hope for those who dared to dream. When Marcus Johnson's quiet walk home turns into a tense confrontation with Officer Hartley, the clash ignites a cascade of revelations, hidden truths about Millbrook's darkest secrets and Marcus's extraordinary intellect, forcing the town to confront its prejudice as Marcus's brilliance begins to rewrite its future. The chill of the autumn air seemed to seep into Marcus's very bones as he walked home from the library, his thoughts consumed by the equations he had been working on. They were theoretical constructs, ideas that danced at the edge of possibility, but to Marcus, they felt as real as the ground beneath his feet. His mind was a labyrinth of numbers and concepts, a place where he could escape the suffocating weight of Millbrook's expectations. But tonight, even the sanctuary of his thoughts couldn't shield him from the reality that awaited. As he rounded the corner of Maple Street, Marcus noticed the familiar silhouette of Officer Hartley's patrol car parked under the glow of a flickering street light. The officer leaned against the vehicle, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten, a reflex born of countless similar encounters. He kept his pace steady, his eyes forward, but he could feel the weight of Hartley's stare like a physical force pressing against him. "Hey, you," Hartley called out, his voice carrying an edge that made Marcus's heart race. He stopped, turning slowly, his hands visible at his sides. "What are you doing out here so late?" The question was laced with suspicion, as though Marcus's very presence was an anomaly that needed to be explained. "I'm just heading home," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. He had learned long ago that any hint of defiance would only escalate the situation. Still, he couldn't suppress the flicker of anger that rose within him. Why did he always have to justify his existence in this town? Hartley stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. "Mind if I take a look in that bag?" The question wasn't really a question, and Marcus knew it. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all the officer needed to interpret his reluctance as guilt. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Hartley's tone grew sharper, his movements more aggressive, and before Marcus could fully process what was happening, he found himself against the cold metal of the patrol car, his wrists bound by handcuffs. The textbooks and notebooks spilled from his bag onto the pavement, their contents scattered like the fragments of his dignity. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs filling the air like the rustling of leaves. Among them was Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from Marcus. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "Officer, this boy has done nothing wrong. I've known him since he was a child. Let him go." But Hartley dismissed her protests with a wave of his hand, his focus unwavering. To him, this was about control, about asserting his authority in a world where he felt it slipping away. Marcus, however, remained silent, his mind racing not with fear but with determination. He knew this moment would not define him. It would be the catalyst for something greater. By the time Marcus was released, the damage had been done. The incident became the talk of the town, dividing Millbrook into those who defended Hartley's actions and those who saw them for what they were, a blatant abuse of power. But for Marcus, the humiliation was secondary to the fire it ignited within him. If the world insisted on seeing him as a problem, he would show them the solution. He threw himself into his work with a fervor he had never known before. The algorithms he had been developing took on new meaning, their potential applications extending far beyond the confines of theoretical physics. Marcus wasn't just solving equations, he was building a future where the barriers of prejudice and ignorance could be dismantled by the sheer force of innovation. As the weeks passed, whispers began to circulate about the young man from Millbrook who was poised to revolutionize his field. Marcus's name reached the ears of Dr. Elena Carter, a renowned physicist who had once faced her own battles against societal expectations. Intrigued by his work, she reached out, offering him an opportunity to present his findings at a prestigious academic conference. The night before the conference, Marcus stood in his room, staring at the equations scrawled across his walls. Each line represented a piece of himself, a fragment of his journey. He thought of the countless nights spent poring over textbooks, the sacrifices his mother had made to support his dreams, and the moment on Maple Street that had nearly broken him. Nearly, but not quite. When Marcus took the stage the next day, the room fell silent. He spoke with a clarity and passion that left no doubt about the brilliance of his mind. The audience, a sea of scholars and skeptics, rose to their feet in applause, their preconceived notions shattered. Back in Millbrook, the ripples of Marcus's success began to reach even the most closed-off corners. Officer Hartley, once so certain of his own righteousness, found himself confronted by a community that was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. Change came slowly, as it always does, but it came nonetheless. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. He knew the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he also knew he was ready. In the heart of Millbrook, a diamond had been formed, and its brilliance was impossible to ignore. The night of the confrontation arrived like a storm no one had seen coming. Marcus Johnson, walking home after a late study session at the library, found himself under the cold glare of Officer Hartley's patrol car headlights. The officer, fueled by suspicion rather than evidence, demanded answers to questions that carried the weight of accusation. Marcus, his voice steady but his heart racing, answered with a calm that belied the storm brewing within him. Yet, Hartley's biases had already written the script for this encounter, and no amount of logic or truth could rewrite it. When Hartley reached for his handcuffs, Marcus's protests were drowned out by the officer's booming commands. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs cutting through the crisp autumn air. Among them was Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a retired physics professor who had recently moved to Millbrook. She watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and anger, her sharp mind already piecing together the injustice of it all. As Marcus was forced into the back of the patrol car, his backpack, its contents spilling onto the ground, caught her eye. A notebook, filled with complex equations and diagrams, lay open like a window into Marcus's brilliance. What followed was a whirlwind of events that thrust Millbrook into the national spotlight. Marcus's arrest sparked outrage among the town's younger generation, who took to social media to share his story. Videos of the encounter went viral, igniting a firestorm of debates about race, authority, and the hidden prejudices that still plagued communities like Millbrook. Protests erupted, led by Marcus's classmates and allies, demanding accountability and justice. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes, compelled by what she had seen in Marcus's notebook, reached out to his family. She offered not only her support but also a platform to showcase the extraordinary mind that had been overshadowed by prejudice. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's case became a rallying cry for change. The town, once content to ignore its undercurrents of bias, was forced to confront its own reflection. Officer Hartley, under mounting pressure, faced an internal investigation that ultimately led to his suspension. But for Marcus, the true victory lay not in the dismantling of Hartley's authority but in the opportunities that began to unfold. Dr. Hayes introduced Marcus to colleagues at a prestigious university, where his work was met with astonishment. His algorithms, initially dismissed as the musings of a high school student, were revealed to hold groundbreaking potential in quantum computing. The culmination of Marcus's journey came in a packed auditorium at the university, where he presented his findings to a room of esteemed scientists. As he spoke, his voice steady and confident, the weight he had carried for so long seemed to lift. The applause that followed was not just for his intellect but for his resilience, his refusal to let the world define him by its narrow expectations. Among the audience, his parents sat with tears in their eyes, their pride immeasurable. Hayes, too, watched with a sense of fulfillment, knowing she had played a small part in helping Marcus reach this moment. Back in Millbrook, the town began to change in ways both subtle and profound. Conversations that had long been avoided were now unavoidable. Schools implemented programs to address implicit bias, and the police department underwent mandatory training. Marcus's story became a symbol of what could happen when the barriers of prejudice were dismantled, even if only piece by piece. And though Marcus had left Millbrook for the wider world, his impact remained, a reminder that brilliance knows no boundaries, and that sometimes, it takes one voice to ignite a revolution. As Marcus stood on the cusp of a future he had fought so hard to claim, he understood the power of his journey. It wasn't just about proving his worth to others, it was about proving it to himself. He had turned the pain of injustice into a catalyst for change, not just for himself but for an entire community. And in doing so, he had become more than a young man with a brilliant mind. He had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the unyielding strength of the human spirit. The events that unfolded in Millbrook left an indelible mark on everyone involved. Marcus Johnson, once a quiet teenager navigating the complexities of identity and ambition, emerged as a symbol of resilience and brilliance. What began as an unjust confrontation with Officer Hartley became a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for the entire town. The incident forced Millbrook to confront its own reflection, revealing cracks in its polished facade that could no longer be ignored. For Marcus, the journey was transformative. The unwarranted scrutiny he endured became a catalyst for his growth, sharpening his resolve and amplifying his voice. His groundbreaking scientific work, born from countless late nights of study and experimentation, captured the attention of minds far beyond Millbrook. Universities and research institutions clamored for his insight, but it was his humanity, his ability to rise above anger and channel his energy into progress, that truly set him apart. Marcus didn't just prove his worth, he redefined it on his own terms. Officer Hartley, too, faced a reckoning. The community's outcry and the investigation that followed his actions forced him to confront the prejudices he had long justified. While redemption is a journey, not a single act, the mirror held up to him by Marcus in the town's awakening left him with a choice: to remain stagnant or to change. Whether he took that step remains a question for another day, but the seeds of accountability had been planted. Millbrook itself began to shift. Conversations that once felt taboo now echoed in town halls, classrooms, and living rooms. The collision between Marcus and Hartley became a story retold not as a tragedy, but as a turning point, a reminder of the work still to be done. The river that once symbolized the town's division now felt like a current pulling people toward a shared understanding, however tentative. As Marcus prepared to leave Millbrook for a future that promised endless possibilities, he stood at the edge of the river one last time. The water, shimmering in the morning light, seemed to whisper of both the past and the future. He thought of the town he was leaving behind, not with bitterness, but with hope. Change, he realized, is slow and often painful, but it begins with a single spark. and he had been that spark. To those who hear Marcus's story, let it be a call to action. Challenge the biases you encounter, whether in others or within yourself. Stand up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. And above all, never underestimate the power of your own mind to shape the future. As Marcus walked away from the river and toward his new life, he carried more than just his textbooks and dreams. He carried the promise of a brighter tomorrow, not just for himself, but for everyone willing to believe in the possibility of change. Let his story remind us all, brilliance knows no boundaries, and resilience can light the way through even the darkest of nights.